screen. Okay, well, welcome everyone tonight. This is one of my favorite talks, just because it's got so many interesting and amazing things that insects do. So with one little exception that snuck in, every animal that I'm going to talk about tonight will hopefully be a local one that you can see right in the Maryland, Virginia area. A lot of my pictures actually are from local photographers who work in Virginia, so they're actually much closer, taken closer to where a lot of you live than where I do. So I work at Irvine Nature Center, but I also volunteer at the USGS Bee Lab, Native Bee Lab at Patuxent Wildlife Refuge. And so there's quite a lot of things about animals that mimic bees and stuff like that. So you'll probably notice that I keep sneaking in bees whenever I can, but there's lots of other insects that I cover as well tonight. So I hope you enjoy tonight's presentation. If you do have questions, just pop them in the chat, and then BJ will stop me and like ask questions if they're relevant to what the animal we're talking about. Okay. So just to be clear, what we're going to talk about tonight is I'm actually not going to cover camouflage, which a lot of insects are absolutely amazing at, like the swallowtail caterpillar here that's doing a great job of looking like a piece of poop. So that when an animal tries to pretend to be an inanimate object, that's called masquerade. So I'm not covering that, even though that's really cool, or like the little emerald looper caterpillar here. That's actually not just looking like a piece of a flower, it's actually collected little pieces of petal and stuck them to its body, and that's actually what all this roughness on the caterpillar is. So it's not just born looking like that, it's actually made an effort to try and camouflage itself. And then of course straight camouflage are things like katydids that just have this amazing appearance of looking like a leaf. Probably one of the best known animals that does amazing kind of camouflage to prey on other insects is the orchid prey mantis. But as I said, I'm not going to cover animals like that because that one is from Asia, and the stuff we're going to talk about tonight will be right here in the Maryland area. So what we are going to talk about tonight is mimicry, which is basically animals pretending to be other animals. And they can do that by their appearance, by their behavior, by smell, and by sounds. And almost all mimicry is either to avoid being eaten or to try and eat. And of all the insects in our area, there's only 3 that I found that do mimicry for other reasons, and usually it kind of revolves around sexual issues. So the 3 that are doing mimicry for another reason is the Cartesia parasitic wasp that you can see here, which is a tiny little wasp, and it's actually like a gardener's friend, because the animal that it parasitizes is actually cabbage white caterpillars. So the bane of any gardener are those caterpillars that can destroy your cabbage crops. And so this wasp is our great friend. But interestingly enough, the males of this species, having mated with a female, then mimic the pheromones of a female, so that any rival males that might be around will actually fly and chase the male because they think it's a female, and thus the female, remains mated with him and doesn't have another male come along to mate. So he mimics being a female. In contrast, the wood sprite damselflies here, if you've ever watched odonata, so dragonflies and damselflies at a pond, you'll know like what kind of like energetic creatures dragonflies are. And this particular one is a female that sometimes mimics being a male of the same species. And we actually think that they do that to try and avoid the over amorous attentions of the males. So like, it's still being studied why they mimic males, but not all of the females do, but some of the females mimic being males. And then finally, some of them are really sneaky, which is German cockroaches, where females will mimic being kind of receptive to males, because males bring nuptial gifts of food and give them to females when they're expecting to mate. And so females actually make the signals that they are receptive for mating, even when they aren't, so that they get more food from the males. So there's all these like sneaky little ways that animals are fooling their own species. But this is really unusual. Normally, mimicry is done to fool other species. So what we're going to see tonight is lots and lots of insects trying to pretend to look like more scary insects. And in this particular case, a lot of them are trying to look like bees or wasps because of the fact that they're a common animal and they sting a lot. So what we're going to look at is like, how good do you have to be as a mimic to fool and a predator that you might be something unpleasant to eat, that you might sting or might taste bad. So you might look at these animals and you'll be like, look at them, and you can kind of see like, these are not actually a wasp or a bee. They have big eyes, short antenna, or long antenna in the case of this one, but you can see the line down the back that's telling us this is a beetle. So for us, these are obviously, after a bit of close inspection, not a bee or a wasp. But most of the time, how close do you want to get to an animal that you think might sting you before you're going to decide, oh, actually, it's a harmless fly and not going to sting you? Okay, so if you're going to mimic an animal, you have to choose an animal. Obviously, when I say choose, this is just something that happens through evolution. There's no conscious effort by any of these animals, but there's going to be an animal that you're going to model, use as your model of what you're going to mimic. And most of the time, mimicry is taking place of these kind of animals. So there's animals that really are distasteful or dangerous. So distasteful to eat, like contain toxins, bad flavors, or they can sting. And to warn other animals about this, they have what we call warning colors, or aposematism. So the most normal colors for warning is things like the black and red. So everything from our ladybugs to these Florida stink bugs. They're often yellow and black, and that's very common amongst our stinging animals like this sand wasp. Or they can just be black and white. So any of those combinations usually tell us that that's a warning coloration. Stay away from me, I'm going to hurt you, or I'm going to taste bad. And if you really want to pull out all the stops, then you can be yellow, black, red, and white, and you're like totally signaling to everyone that I am a really, really awful animal. And some of these ones, as well as looking so impressively scary, also release smells. So if you've like handled things like some of the stink bugs and ladybugs, they release a chemical signal that also warns of their distasteful, taste, that will warn predators that I taste bad, stay away from me. And it tends to be a good thing to be one of these, warning coloration animals. So if you have this type of coloration, you tend to have a longer life, because even after you finish breeding, if you hang around in the population, it's more likely that a predator will come along and eat you, and then they will after they've eaten you, that they'll know that any animal that looks like you tastes bad, and so they're going to less likely to eat your companions in the world, kind of thing, the same kind of species. Whereas if you actually tend to be the kind of animal that camouflages itself, usually most of those animals, as soon as they've mated and so perform their function in the world, they usually die as quickly as possible. And so that's why a lot of animals like lunar moths that have cryptic, these hiding colorations, don't eat as adults, because as soon as they've finished with breeding, they want to die so that birds don't learn how to find those animals and eat them. So if you're in these warning colors, you get to live a longer life. And there's been some studies done, and it seems like these animals are also more successful in evolution terms. So you're less likely to go extinct if you use this strategy. Most of the mimics tonight are going to be trying to look like those, in those color ranges, such as this Syriana wasp fly. And this is one of the absolute, great one of the great flies for really going all out to look like a wasp. So you might know, if you've ever tried to distinguish between flies and bees and wasps, that one of the ways you can tell them apart is that flies have very short antennae. But the wasp flies, actually, they have short antennae, but they put the antenna on like an extension that comes off their head. So they have like a pedestal from their head, and then their antenna start from there. So that allows them to look like they have long antenna. And then, of course, most flies are pretty straight-waisted, but these ones have gone for having the wasp waist. So you have to look incredibly closely to look at this fly and not think that that is a wasp. Okay, so we're going to run through a few of the different types of mimicry that we can have. So one of the first types of mimicry is actually to just pretend to be yourself. The absolute master for this is our local grey hair streak, and they have little tails off the backs of their wings that look like antenna, and then they have spots that look like eyes. And so they have both the appearance and then behavior that makes it look like they have their head is at the other end. So they usually sit with tail up, because that's the opposite of the way most butterflies sit, so that a predator is always going to go for the top of the beak butterfly where they think that head is. So let's just watch. So yeah, if you ever get to see one of these butterflies, they're pretty common in our yards, you'll notice that the whole time they're keeping that action going of just rubbing their back wings backwards and forwards to imitate the moving antenna. And Sukharov actually did a big study on how effective this is to avoid being eaten. It was an experiment at Florida University, and what they did was they caught a jumping spider, and they had it in a cage, and they put 11 different species of butterflies and moths in that cage. And the jumping spider was able to catch every single one of them until they put the hair streak in. And every single time the jumping spider would launch itself and try and catch, which was actually the back of the butterfly. And so the butterfly was able to jump, fly away forwards and escape the jumping spider. And the butterfly escaped successfully 16 times in a row. And after that, the jumping spider actually refused to try and catch the butterfly because he was totally outwitted by the butterfly. Come on. Sorry, I'm just trying. There we go. Okay. So yeah, so we might know, if you've looked at butterflies, that eye spots are an incredibly common thing on the decoration of different butterflies. But it's kind of interesting that the eye spots, have to be used very selectively to be effective against birds who are really, have very good eyesight and are easily able to tell when they're being fooled by a butterfly. So a series of experiments was done on this, our little wood satyr, which if you might see, it's a hard butterfly to spot because it only lives in woodland areas. It's well named. And so it lives in this kind of semi-gloom of, the shade of a full canopy woodland. And what they did was they produced models of the wood satyr and tested how birds would attack models of the satyr. And what they discovered was under full sunlight, birds were never fooled. Every single attack on the butterfly would be right on the head area. If it was done in full shade, then the birds were actually also able most of the time to hit the head and then occasionally some of the other areas. But in the sort of semi-gloom light of a canopy area, they found that the birds were fooled by those eye spots. So, this butterfly has evolved to make its eye spots work in the habitat that it lives in. So spots are also really common in a lot of our larger moths, like this, very impressive Polyphemus moth, which has these large eyes that kind of are designed not to deflect attack, but to actually startle a predator. So the wings open up, a bird might be coming for this moth and suddenly see what looks like a much larger predator looking back at them, and it'll startle, they'll jump back, and that's all the moth needs to escape. Now, there was some work done on these different types of moths, and they actually discovered that the moths that are most likely to have these large eye spots, coincidentally, also happen to be all the types of moths that like to feed on fermented fruit on the ground. And it's actually thought that the reason they all have eye spots is because they all get a little bit drunk actually drinking all the fermented fruit. And so their reactions aren't as fast for getting away from predators. And so the startle of opening their wings and flashing those eye spots, oops. Oh, it's like an alarm going off in my house. This is what happens when I ask my family to don't make a noise.
Oh my God.
But can you make dinner for yourself? And I feel like my kids have tried to cook some toast. There we go, they got it off. So I have teenage kids who obviously just burned some toast. Sorry about that. So yeah, so the eye spots are designed to let the moths fly away when they've been drunk or a bit tipsy. So I like that use of eye spots. Okay, another type of mimicry, rather than just auto-mimicry, is a type of mimicry called Malaria Mimicry. And really, a lot of times it's not what we would think of as mimicry, but it's one of the things that makes life for a naturalist very difficult. Because basically, it means that animals end up looking like other types of animals, even though they all of these are all bumblebees and can all sting each other. It could sting you, and so evolution drives them to look alike, so that if a bird has ever tried to eat one of these species of bumblebee, it's going to recognize any of the other species as a dangerous animal. So that's called Mullerian mimicry. When you're telling the truth, you are all equally dangerous. But when there's a lot of species that all look like this and are all signaling that I can sting, stay away, you also get a lot of mimics trying to look like you. So if you look at all these different animals with a quick glance, any of them you might think was a bumblebee, but in actual fact, they all have those big eyes, and the big eyes and short antennae tell you that these are actually all flies. So flies, can't sting. They're completely harmless to a bird that might want to eat them, but they're all trying to look like those scary bumblebees. And, even though I look at bumblebees all the time, I have to admit, sometimes I get fooled by these before I look more closely. But these are what we might call, you know, sheep in wolves' clothing. They're trying to look scary when they're really not. But some of these mimics are so good, like the Volucella here, that they can actually fool bumblebees themselves. So the Volucella looks so much like a bumblebee that they can sneak into the nests of bumblebees where they lay their eggs, and then their larvae actually eat kind of all the detritus in the bottom of a nest. So all the, you know, abandoned bits of skin and, you know, old bits of comb and stuff like that. They eat all of that in the bottoms of the nest. And so they're able to get into the nest because other bees just think they're a bumblebee. So when you're doing it to look like an animal, to actually fool that animal itself, that has its own special name, Wasp-Manian mimicry. So yeah, it's not easy to tell some of these mimics when they can even fool the animal themselves. Okay, so a lot of us you know very well the monarch butterfly. Oh, let me see, I should say, is there any questions before I keep going? And so I was going to move into butterflies, having talked about some bees there. Are we good?
Nothing in the chat.
Okay, good job. Okay, so for a lot of us, we all know the monarch butterfly as this like amazing butterfly. Now, even when I first learned about monarch butterflies, one of the first things I was told about them was that there was this other butterfly called the viceroy that looks like a monarch, but is actually just pretending to be a monarch, and it's not distasteful like the monarch is. So we were told it was like this Batesian form where the viceroy doesn't actually taste bad, it's just pretending to. But it's kind of interesting that I got taught that like in the 2000s or whatever, even though when I looked it up, it was like in the 1970s that the research was done where they took these viceroys and fed them to birds, and found that birds found them just as distasteful as monarchs. And so in actual fact, the link between viceroys and monarchs is malarian. They're both trying to look like something that tastes bad because they both do taste bad. The caterpillars of viceroys eat mostly willow, which has like salic acids in, the stuff that we can then make aspirin and stuff out of, and they accumulate that in their bodies, and that's what tastes just as bad. But weirdly enough, there is a type of mimicry called Browlerian, which is like one of those just very obscure forms of mimicry, which is where a species actually imitates itself. And one of the things they found about monarchs is that the first generation of monarchs actually accumulate many more of the cardiac glycosides that are in milkweed than the fourth generation does. So each generation, the first and the second and the third and the fourth, are more distasteful, and they become less distasteful through those generations. And so actually it's the fourth generation benefit from the fact that a lot of predators have tried eating the first or second generation monarchs and found them more distasteful and left them alone. So yet another type of mimicry that happens. But when we want to look at butterflies, if you want to look at a type of mimicry, the really amazing complex that we have here in the Maryland, Virginia area is definitely the swallowtails. So all these different types of swallowtails are all trying to mimic the pipevine swallowtail in the center here. So the pipevine swallowtail eats pipevine and accumulates oh, I'm trying to remember the name of it now. It will come back to me in a sec. But they have a toxic chemical that they accumulate that makes them taste very distasteful. So much so that lots of different butterflies, all the other swallowtails here, are all mimicking the pipevine. So we have the spicebush swallowtail, the black swallowtail, the eastern tiger swallowtail, and then the red-spotted purple, which isn't a swallowtail, are all depending on mimicking the pipevine. Now, I found this one kind of really unusual because all these other butterflies I see so much more often than I do the pipevine. And it's like, again, how can you like mimic a butterfly if it doesn't seem very, like a common thing to mimic? But we know that this is what's happening when we look at the red-spotted purple. Because in our area, this is what a red-spotted purple looks like. But, and I actually was lucky enough to spot one of these a few weeks ago. I went up to Maine and I saw the white admiral here. And these are actually the same species, and only in the areas where the pipevine swallowtail, exists, does the red-spotted purple form of the butterfly is the type that we see. And if you go north of where you find pipevine swallowtails, the butterfly always looks like the white admiral form. And then in the areas where pipevine swallowtails are not very common, in this area up here, so through Pennsylvania and up through New York kind of state, you'll get hybridization. So you get like the two different forms, you can see them both. But like in Maryland and South, you're only going to see the red-spotted purple type. And then the other butterfly that has an equally amazing reaction to having the pipevine swallowtail around is the eastern tiger swallowtail. So you might know that around us we have like two different morphs. So this is the black morph of the eastern tiger swallowtail, and this is a female because only females go into this black morph. And if you see with the side view, you can see like those tiger stripes are still visible through the back of the wing there. So the females are taking advantage of looking like a pipevine swallowtail to avoid predation, so that they live longer and they can lay more eggs. But for boys, the yellow morph of the swallowtail is much more appealing to females, and they will preferentially select the yellow forms to mate with. So the whole area that these swallowtails exist, you will only see the males are always in that yellow form, because for them it's more important to find a mate than to live a long time. So they are in the yellow form. And so again, in the areas where the pipevine swallowtail is common, you're going to have mostly black morphs. And then as you move further north, the females are going to be more commonly in the yellow morph, because that's tends to be the form that is preferentially selected during mating. Okay.
Oh, we have a question from Dan. Dan asked, how do insects learn which other insects to mimic?
So they learn by natural selection, because if you don't look like it, you get eaten more often. And so more of the insects that look like an insect that tastes bad are more likely to survive and breed longer. And so it's just over, hundreds of thousands of years that the selective pressure of evolution causes these color variations. So, the animals have only got so much, difference that they can make to how they appear, which is why, the flies, even though it would be advantageous for them to have long antennae to look more like what the animal they're mimicking, they don't have the genes, to be able to make those antennae longer, so they don't. But if they do have, genetic variation that allows them to have color variations, and then predators just tend to eat more of the ones that look harmless, and so that's how it happens. That there's no actual choosing. So if I ever say choose, it's just because that's the way we talk when we're talking about animals, but not how evolution really works. But good question. Okay, so if you, for instance, did want to choose which animal you should mimic, there's a lot of pressure to look as much as you can like a really scary animal. So one of the things that we can look at to see which animals are most likely to have mimics is to find out what animals have really painful stings. Because if you've been stung once by something that really, really hurt, then you're going to be very cautious about going near another animal that looks like the one that just hurt a lot. But of course, like for ages, we didn't know which animals were really, really hurt when he got stung. Luckily for us, there was a slightly crazy guy called Schmidt who decided that he would get stung by all the stinging animals of the world. And he wrote about it in The Sting of the Wild, which is a very funny book if you get a chance to read it. And then he took all those stings and he made up a thing called Schmidt Sting Pain Index. And I love this the pain index because of the way he describes the stings. So for instance, a level 1 sting, he says, is light, ephemeral, almost fruity, a tiny spark that singed a single hair on your arm. Whereas by the time you get to a level 3, it's bold, unrelenting, someone using a power drill to excavate your ingrained toenail. Starting to sound like something I do not want to be stung by. And incredibly, it goes up to like level 4. So to give you just like a bit of a thing, you know, where things are, you know, many people have obviously been stung by a honeybee. So that's in there at the level 2 level. If you've been stung by a yellow paper wasp, they come in at a 3, or harvester ants, which I'm like pretty glad I haven't been stung by one of those. I have been stung by a red ant, and that was painful enough. So you would think like the higher your sting is on the pain index, the more likely you are to be avoided. Luckily in Maryland, we don't, or Virginia, sorry, we don't have either of the level 4 insects. So the highest pain index sting in Maryland is actually the velvet ant, which is not an ant at all. It's actually a wingless wasp that crawls around on the ground. So she's very exposed to predators and has developed both a very hard case that makes her hard to eat and this incredibly painful sting. So you would think if you're something that crawls around on the ground, it'd be a good idea to look like this ant. And indeed, there are more mimics of velvet ants than of any other kind of insect in America. But unfortunately, of course, you do have to be an animal that crawls around on the ground because that's where you'll find velvet ants. So it's no point imitating them if you don't spend a lot of time on the ground. But there's a lot of wasps, spider wasps that are on the ground, and jumping spiders and stuff that look like velvet ants. But the majority of animals in our area want to be able to fly around as insects, and so they tend to mimic our most common scary flying insects, which of course are like, yellow jackets and other scary wasps kind of thing. So some of these mimics are absolutely amazing. As you can see, the false horn fly here, you really have to look closely to not think that this is a yellow jacket. But there's a whole suite of different hoverflies out there that look like different forms of these insects. So some of them look more bee-like, some are looking more wasp-like, but they're all got those different striping patterns on, trying to fool you that I am something scary, don't bother me. And if you remember, right at the beginning, I was saying so what makes the decision of how good a mimic you can be? What makes some mimics look almost perfect copies of their model, and some just look a bit like it? And when they did the study, it seems like the main reason that causes the really close mimicry is actually if you're larger. So if you're a pretty big fly flying around out there, you're going to be a big tasty meal for some bird, and so a bird's going to look quite closely at you, and you're going to need to be a pretty close mimic for it to work. Whereas if you're a small fly, you're just not enough of a meal for a lot of our predators, which is mostly birds, to take that second look to check if you are a wasp or a harmless fly that would make a nice little meal. So the great thing about this really close mimicry is that the insects that do this thing of looking exactly like, in this case, this fly is trying to look like a bold-faced hornet, is if you see one of these mimics, you can usually get the identification of that fly to the species, because there's only one species of fly that is doing that exact mimicry. Whereas normally the other flies, you can usually just get to genus or even family kind of thing, because there's so many flies and they all look so similar. Okay, so that's a lot of our I was thinking I was going to play for a second, sorry. So that was a lot of our insects that are just looking like predators. Yeah, they're a scary warning animal. But now I wanted to move on to some different types of mimicry. So this one is a caterpillar that actually uses acoustic mimicry. And before I play this, I do want to just say that no caterpillars were hurt during the recording of this. So that amazing walnut sphinx moth caterpillar, which is one of the largest caterpillars in Virginia, and would be a tasty meal for any bird, is actually making that loud hissing noise at an amazing 80 decibels, which is kind of amazing. And those recordings were taken, and then they those recordings and played them at a bird feeder. And what they discovered was that that sound is a really good imitation of the chickadee alarm call. And when they played the noise at a bird, close to a bird feeder, all the birds would immediately hear that, think that it was an alarm call, and they would all fly away. So when the caterpillar makes that noise, the bird that's about to eat it hears this alarm call and thinks, oh, the chickadee is making the alarm call that there's a predator about. And so the only thing that overrides having such a great big meal as that caterpillar is a thought that a bird, like a sharp-shinned hawk, is coming and going to eat you, and so the birds will fly away. So it's literally a caterpillar crying wolf to get the birds to leave it alone. There's a whole load of moths that also do acoustic mimicry, and to understand what they're doing, we have to listen first to the dog-bane tiger moth, which eats dog bane and gets cardiac glycosides in its body, so does taste distasteful. And so to advertise that to moths that are hunting it at night, it actually has to do clicking to warn bats that it tastes bad. So it makes these clicking noises. So it's doing a similar system to obviously all those cicadas that we were listening to a couple of weeks ago. And then they tested, this is one of those moths, the dog-bane tiger moth, making its clicking noise in an area where they had captive red and brown bats. So you can see the bat comes up, but then it hears that clicking and it's like, oh, that's one of the ones that tastes bad, so I'm not going to eat it. Move on to the next one. But there's another moth, which weirdly enough eat the milkweed tiger moth, which eats milkweed and could also accumulate all of that cardiac glycosides, but it doesn't. These moths actually taste perfectly fine, but they mimic the dog-bane tiger moth and do the same clicking. So what they found was when they tested it with the red and the brown bats, that the red bats would listen to that clicking and they would go, oh, that's one of the ones that tastes bad, and they wouldn't eat it. But weirdly enough, the brown bats actually could recognize the difference between the two types of moths, and so they will eat the milkweed tiger moths, even though they're trying to mimic the dog bane moth. Okay, so you can also mimic by your behavior. Now, there's a whole group of jumping spiders that try to pretend to be an ant. Now, you might realize that if you're an insect trying to be an ant, you've got a bit of a problem because you've got two legs. If you're a spider, sorry, trying to be an ant, that you have a problem because you've got two legs too many, but you don't have any antenna. So what they discovered was when they recorded the movements of these spiders, that the spiders have a very cunning way of making it look like they only have 6 legs and they do have antenna. So you might notice that what the spider is actually doing is like just constantly raising its front 2 legs to make it look like it's got an antenna. It's got antenna. So if you just took a glance at that spider walking past, you would think it was an ant. And of course, ants are kind of like the scary creatures of the insect world. They've got a lot of friends, and you never want to mess with an ant, because if you do, a whole bunch of the friends are going to come and help them out. So looking like an ant is like a very good deterrent. And these jumping spiders hang out kind of close to ant nests, but they don't want to get too close because ants can tell the difference and the ants will attack these jumping spiders. But we know it's a big advantage for the jumping spiders to look like an ant, because it's a major sacrifice to look like an ant. But these spiders, they can no longer jump, so they're jumping spiders that can't jump, and also having those narrow waists limits the number of eggs that they can lay. So there's a big payment that they make for looking like an ant. But what they discovered was the major prey of these small jumping spiders is actually big jumping spiders. So they tested the jumping spiders, large jumping spiders' interest in these jumping spiders by first having the spiders watch little videos of a jumping spider walking past looking like a ant. So this one is like raising its antenna. So it has a good look, but it doesn't jump on it. And then it just has a regular jumping spider walk past, and if that was a jumping spider, it would be dead. So they found it was really effective. Looking like an ant stops you being eaten by a bigger spider. Okay. So those are all forms of defensive mimicry, but there are also a whole load of animals that use their mimicry for bad reasons. So this is aggressive mimicry to help them catch their prey. So you might know that in your yard, you have probably large numbers of aphids on some of your plants. And on those plants, there are actually spiders not jumping spiders, these are real ants. There are ants who tend those aphids, and they actually milk them to get the honeydew off them. And so these ants act like shepherds to the aphids, and they will protect them from any predators that might want to come and eat their flock. But the animals that do like to eat them are actually lacewing larvae. So they will come into your yard and try and eat these aphids. But if they look like this and an ant comes along, the ants will attack them. So the aphids have come up with a way of actually looking like these sheep aphids. So every time they eat an aphid, they actually take the aphid body, having sucked all the juice out from the aphid, they take the aphid and throw it on their back. So they're covered in the, exoskeletons of all the aphids that they've eaten, and this gives them their sheep's clothing over the top so that they're hidden, and the ants, if they come up to them, touch their bodies and go, oh no, that's just an aphid, and they leave them alone, and so they can sneak in there and eat those aphid sheep. So you can see like the wings and stuff of the aphids on their body here, and they can actually move around. I have a little video of these this is the late swing larvae crawling around under the weight of all the exoskeletons. So, but because they sucked out most of the bodies of these aphids, it's not actually too heavy. You can see those huge mandibles on their front that they use to grab the aphids. So these are definitely gardeners' friends in our yard. Okay, another set of flies aren't just like animals trying to escape being eaten. They also will look like flies, like bees, sorry, to not only avoid being eaten, but also to help them in catching their prey. So robber flies are amazing predators, and this was not one that's imitating looking like a bumblebee, but they definitely will eat bumblebees. And these butterflies are so good at mimicking bumblebees that it can actually look at the robber flies and tell you which species of bumblebee they're imitating. So this one here is trying to look like the common eastern bumblebee, whereas the sacrata, Lafria sacrata over here, this robber fly is only found in the mountains, so the west of Maryland and Virginia. And this one actually looks like the Bombus vagans, which is the half black bumblebee, which is also only found in the western areas, and is actually one that's like starting to disappear actually and moving further north. So they're such good mimics, you can tell the species that they're mimicking. Okay, now this is one of my favorite mimicry that goes on in our area. And you might have been able to tell by now that I actually haven't lived my whole life in America. When I came here from Europe, I was just amazed by fireflies because I had never seen them before. And for me, they're just a magical part of summer, and I actually love them. And when I heard the story of what happens with fireflies, and then I actually got to witness it, it just made me even more excited about these amazing animals. So we probably know that fireflies are making their flash signals in order to attract mates. So the ones that you mostly see flying around are actually a type called Photinus, and they are the ones that are also called Big Dipper fireflies. So they fly in kind of a J shape with their light on. They're actually flying like in wave formation, but they just put their lights on as they do the up part of the wave. And the lights are on for just over a second while you're seeing that flash. And the males are doing that to impress females who sit on the ground. And if the females think, wow, that was a really good light, they actually respond with a short flash of their own 2 seconds after the male has finished his flash. And if the males get that signal, they'll go down to visit the female. And when they go down, they actually take what's called a nuptial gift that they give to the females. And that gift is actually a package of lucibufagins, which is a really distasteful chemical that the female uses to put into her eggs so that all of her offspring will be distasteful and will protect them from predators. Now, we have another type of firefly in our region, and that's called the Photurase firefly. Photurase are much bigger, and they actually do not have any lucibufagins. They're not able to generate them themselves. But the female Photurase have their own way of acquiring these lucibufagins. So what they do is they have a different signal. The males of the Photurase actually do a double flash, and when they see that, they will do a responsive flash, and the male will come down and they'll mate. But after that, the female continues to sit there and she looks for the Big Dipper fireflies doing their flash. And what she then does is she will mimic female Big Dipper fireflies, and she will respond. And of course, males, being males, are like, oh, she likes me, and he will fly down to the female, hoping to mate. And what he finds instead is actually a firefly that's about 3 times his size, who will grab him and eat him to get those lucibuffogens so that she can give them to her young. Because obviously every mum wants to give their babies the best chance of in life that they can. Now, the males are not totally defensive. As soon as they are grabbed, they are able to exude a sticky liquid that can gum up the mouths of the Photurase just long enough to give them a chance to escape. But yeah, I actually went out on the 3rd, so last week, and I actually got to see one of the Photurase eating a Photinus. So I was like really excited to see this in action, the mimicry of a femme fatale fireflies. Okay, another really cool way of catching your prey is to be a bowless spider. So bowless spiders are really hard to spot because in the daytime they just sit around on leaves, and these guys are doing so that a masquerade. They're looking like a bird dropping, just sitting on their leaf. But at nighttime, another thing happens with these bowless spiders. They go under the leaf and hang on, and then they let out a long piece of their silk, and at the end of that silk they have a big sticky blob. And then they use their silk like a bolus, and they actually swing it round and round and round and use it to lasso any passing moths. Now, the chance of a moth just happening to fly in range is fairly small. So what bolus spiders do is they're able to emit the pheromones of female moths of about 3 different species in our area. And those pheromones, of course, are irresistible to male moths of those species. And they fly in thinking like, oh, there's a female moth that really likes me, is emitting all that pheromones. And instead of that, they're going to get caught by that bolus and eaten. So it always seems to happen to the males, I'm afraid. And the final example of bad things happening to males is my one insect that is actually not found in Maryland, but it's such a cool example of mimicry that I really wanted to include it. And of course, we do have these blister beetles in our area, so you will see them, and you can see sometimes they're young, which climb up onto flowers where they're waiting for passing bees to come by that they're going to jump onto. But in the mid-Atlantic, it's common enough for a bee to come to a flower that they can just like sit on flowers and hope for a bee to turn up. But some of these blister beetles that live in the desert Southwest have to have a bit more of an advanced strategy in order to attract bees to come to them. So this blister beetle, they're young, these tiny little teneroles, and each of these teneroles is about the 800th of the size of a bee, the type of bee that they need to attract to them. So what happens is a group, when their eggs hatch of a blister beetle, all the young will run up a stalk of grass, and then they get in a concentrated mass and try and make a shape that's the right size to imitate a female bee. Then they release a pheromone, all of them together, to give the smell of a female bee. And it's actually the Habroda pallida that they pallida that they're appealing to. And so the male bees will fly in and they approach this big bundle thinking that they've found a female bee to mate with. But actually, when they touch it, they get the shock of their life because all of those little blister beetle larvae like jump onto the back of the male bee. And the male bee then has to fly off with the weight of all these bees on him. But he's very determined because he needs to find a girl so that he can reproduce and send his genes out into the world. When he finds that female bee and mates with her, all the larvae actually jump ship and they jump onto the female bee, because the place that they need to get to is into the nest of this female bee, where they jump off and then they actually eat all the pollen stores that were intended for that female bee's larvae. So they have like this absolutely amazing way of fooling a bee that they are a bee. And to just put it in context, as I said, these bee larvae are tiny compared to the size of a bee. So this is like a mouse managing to fool a coyote that it is a female coyote. And the only way a mouse would be able to do it would be to get 800 of its mouse friends all together, kind of make the rough shape of a coyote, emit the smell of a female coyote, and thus fool the coyote that you were a female coyote. And that's what these blister beetles managed to do. Like, evolution is just kind of amazing. We don't, like I say, have ones that do that here in Maryland, but we do have these things that are parasites on bees as well. And what these are is actually they're kleptoparasites. So these are bees, about 20% of all the bee species in Maryland are this. They parasitize other bees. And so to be able to sneak into the nest of another bee, they have ways to try and appear that they are that bee. So Stelis bees, they actually sneak into the nests of leafcutter bees. You might have seen those holes in your trees recently. And so to smell more like a leafcutter bee, they actually get leaves and kind of chew them up and then smear them on their body to like make themselves smell like a leafcutter bee. Whereas Namada bee sneak into the nests of the ground bees, Andrena, and the male bee, when male Namada, when he like mates with a female Namada, he actually brings a nuptial gift that is a pheromone that makes the female smell like the Andrena bees, so that they can get into the nest. And when I tell people about all these parasitic animals, sometimes they really get upset. And one of the things is that it's really easy to like anthropomorphize and see these animals as like that they're cheaters. They're using special powers to cheat other animals and to get get into nests and take those nests over. But it's really important to remember that a lot of the animal diversity world is actually in these animals that parasitize other animals, and usually most parasitic animals actually parasitize the most common types of bees or any type of other animal. So the leafcutter bees are very common bees, and that's why they get parasitized. And because their numbers get reduced by parasitism, it allows other bees that are much rarer, that are not usually parasitized, to like have a chance to also collect flower resources, sort of thing. So it's all part of like having a balanced ecosystem, and kind of nature like does it best in keeping this balance. And it's usually just when people get involved that we get problems with systems getting out of balance. So I hope you enjoyed learning about all those many different types of mimicry, and that you're going to go out in your yard and look a bit more closely at some of the animals that are out there to see if they really are what you think they are. Like, is this really a jumping spider, or is this just a fly pretending to have legs like a jumping spider on their wings? So this is a very common fly that you'll see in your yard as soon as you start looking. Okay, if anyone wants to ask questions, feel free to unmute. There's some in the chat.
So Claire, the blister beetles I had in my yard last year, they're not the ones you're talking about. The ones you were talking were in the southwest.
Yeah, the ones that group together like that, but they do all parasitize bees and wasps. So the larvae are climbing up onto flowers, like I kind of showed in that one picture, where the little tiny things. So they hang out on those flowers because they know that's where bees and wasps are going to come, and they jump onto them and they go back to the nests, and then they eat all of the pollen that, you know, those bees are working so hard to collect. So yeah, they are parasitizing. But any parasite like that is usually much, much rarer than the animal that they parasitize, because it's hard to find the animal that you want to parasitize. So when I see those blister beetles, I'm always like, wow, like I found one. You know, they're so much harder to find than the animals that they go after.
Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So any other questions? Doesn't look like it. So as I said, I'll send a wrap-up email and I'll get the recording up on YouTube. And I really appreciate your time, Claire.
Oh,
Such a joy.
pleasure.
Okay.
There we go. Come back to everyone. Did I surprise anyone?
Yeah.